Welcome back to the second session. Our first presenter at this session is Dr. Kwabena. He's going to focus on the diaspora. Kwabena is a lecturer at the Institute of African Studies, and believe it or not, he may tell you his own story. The name sounds like he's a Yoruba man from Nigeria. He's actually from the US. He received his bachelor's degree at Morehouse College, went to University of Wisconsin, and finished his PhD here in linguistics. Dr. Kwabena, it's your turn. Come on.
Okay, I wanted to, well, first, can I get permission of my elders to speak formally? Thank you very much. I looked at the topic, and the topic I saw was Legacies of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And the first thing that popped in my mind is that the major legacy is one of miseducation, diseducation, and ignorance about a lot of things. Some things such that we don't know about is the voluntary migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere before Columbus, as you can find out in books like They Came Before Columbus. And you can see huge Olmec heads as high up as where the air conditioner is, chisels of faces that look exactly like those who are seated in this room, that we don't get a chance to learn a lot about. I also was thinking that a lot of things that we don't know about is the global African presence, which was alluded to earlier. You can find Africans in places as far away as India, the ancient African presence in Europe and the Americas. And I also thought another thing that we are ignorant of that is a legacy is that we don't know about the resistance that was talked about by Honorable Ajiman. That we don't know about Haiti, who defeated Napoleon's army, which was said to be the strongest army in the world. That we don't know about Yanga in Mexico, or Nat Turner, or the Stono Rebellion, or Palmares, the first free society in the Western Hemisphere in Brazil in the 1600s, or Nani of Jamaica, or the very first rebellion of enslaved Africans, which actually occurred in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Zanj Revolution, in what is now called the Arabian Peninsula. I was also thinking that we don't know that the very first book in history of humanity was written by African people, the instructions of Ptah-hotep. And we also don't know that the world's first multi-genius was another African named Imhotep, a physician and architect. I was also thinking, but I didn't have time to talk about these things, so I said, oh, okay, well. I also wanted to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where Europeans injected Africans with syphilis knowingly, or how they experimented on Africans using radiation, or even Project Coast in South Africa, where Africans who were fighting against apartheid, they were imprisoned, and Europeans would experiment on them to try to find a virus that would selectively kill only African people. And once they died, they would take a helicopter and drop them off into the ocean, thus the name Project Coast. But I said I didn't have time to talk about this. I also wanted to talk about how the origins of gynecology started in prisons where African people were mutilated, women were mutilated, but I said I don't have time to talk about that. I also wanted to talk about Chukanini, the very last full-blooded Tasmanian, because Europeans exterminated every single last one off of the face of the planet. And these are Africans who had been there for thousands and thousands of years in Tasmania. But I didn't have time to talk about that either. So I decided to talk about what I did have time to speak about. And the main, I came to, as a linguist, I came to the topic, and it was legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. We already have problematized that term, slave trade, and another term that has been introduced is the Ma'afa, and it has a connotation of a great horrific catastrophe, or also mangamizu, which is another word which lets you know it's not just a natural disaster, but it was an intentional decimation of African people. And I started thinking about the word legacy specifically. And in the dialect of English that I speak, legacy tends to have more of a positive connotation. And you know, I started to look up the British National Corpus in order to see the usage of that term, and I found things such as the historic landmarks of England are a wonderful legacy that must be preserved for the future, or building a legacy to stand the test of time, or what was another one? A program for the enduring legacy, all these things. And when we talk about wanting to leave a legacy, we think of establishing a huge building, and then we stop and stand and we say, this will be my legacy. But then you can also have negative connotations. But I said, well, let me not really focus on that. The other aspect of it is that when we talk about legacy, we are talking about an event or period of history, and this is according to the dictionary definition, which is a direct result of it. So a legacy of an event or period of history is something which is a direct result of it and which continues to exist after it is over. So I started to think about this. When we say the legacy is what exists after it is over, I tried to come up in my mind with, on what date did slavery end? And I wasn't able to come up with a date. And I want to make this a little bit interactive. How many people are aware that in places like the United States, slavery is legal? How many people know this? Slavery is legal in the United States. How many today? How many people know that slavery has never been abolished there? Oh, well, let me read the laws. This is the 13th Amendment, which states that, slavery, as the 13th Amendment states, is that involuntary servitude, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And this caveat is something that was not lost on those who created the laws. It says, it shall not exist except as punishment for a crime. Which means that all you have to do is say that all of those people who you're formerly enslaving are criminals. And thus began the criminalization of the race. And there were a lot of ways that this was done. It was done through what we call the black codes, which means that once we establish that you are a vagrant or that you are loitering, it means that if you are sitting here, any of you who are seated here, if you cannot produce a permit which says that you have a job, then we will arrest you. And then you will be sentenced to 5 years in prison where you will work for free under a system called convict leasing. So this means that you are de facto still enslaved. All we have to do is come up with any pretense. And some of the laws that were established were things such as the laws that said that if you, again, can't establish that you have a job, then we can arrest you. If you spit in public, you will be arrested for that. If, for example, you play dice that are sold by Europeans, if you play dice out in the streets, you will be arrested for that. If you speak loudly in the presence of white women, you will be arrested for that. There are all of these things, and one of the main things that they did was they had the pig law. And the pig law said that any piece of livestock that is stolen by an African, it is grand larceny, and it is worth more than $1, and it carries a sentence of 5 years in prison. And at the time, I remember in undergraduate, I studied what was called African American Studies at Morehouse College. And I remember reading a section of the textbook African American Odyssey, where some of the prison guards said, this is much better than slavery. Why? He said, because in slavery, you have to still feed them and clothe them, even in the winter, when they're not working and being productive. But this way, we can work them literally to death. And when one dies, all you have to do is go arrest another one. And it became so scandalous that whenever it was time to harvest cotton in the fall, there was a crime wave apparently because they would arrest all of the black people in the town. So now they still have to work for free and harvest all of this cotton. And then after harvest time, oh, your offense, whatever. And again, the way that these laws were set, it was like the whites would look outside the window and see what black people were doing and make the laws based on that. So if we look outside the window and say, oh, the black people are rolling dice is illegal. oh, the black people that are dancing is illegal. They had something where you could not walk next to a train track if you work on a farm. They had another one that you cannot sell produce from a farm after dark. So they looked and saw, and I want to try to bring it home for you. Let's say, for example, if an ethnic group came into power, where they become presidents, they run the whole parliament, all of these things, and they say, from henceforth, the only legal food to eat is banku with okra. And anyone caught eating fufu has committed a felony. We know who that law is intended to persecute. Or vice versa, let's say anyone caught eating fish and kinke, grand larceny. Therefore, they will be put in prison and they will have to work for free. We know who would be targeted. Tools like, or let's say something, we will make dancing agbaja illegal, only adwa. We know who this is intended to persecute. So these were the types of laws that we had at that time. And the modern day correlate of that is what they would call being disorderly conduct. That's what they call it now. That's the modern day version of vagrancy. And in this convict leasing system, Africans built railroads, laid railroad tracks, they drained swamps, they had to raise cotton, they had to extract turpentine gum, all of these things, and under the lash, under the whip, they would have metal spurs tied to their feet so that they can't run away. They had to, in some cases, get mined for 5 tons of gold and 5 tons of coal in one single day. And some of the conditions, they would be waist deep in water as they are mining this coal. And as they were doing it, they weren't given any place to go to ease themselves. So they had to ease themselves inside of that water. And they were also not given water to drink. This is after, quote unquote, slavery ended, right? They weren't given water to drink. They had to scoop the water from what they were standing in. These were the types of conditions. And it wasn't limited only to adults. That by 1880, at least 1 convict in 4 was an adolescent, under 16 years old. And there are references for this. There's a book called Worse Than Slavery. There's another one called Slavery by Another Name. So what we find is that slavery is not necessary for them to end it. All they have to do is change the name on you, right? Other things that would happen when Alabama instituted it, they would lease convicts out to these major corporations, and they got $14,000 the first year that they did it. And that was 1874. By 1890, they got $164,000. That is the equivalent of about $4.1 million today. Again, 1/3 in Alabama wasn't over 16 years old, and 30 to 40% died in every year of these people. So if I see you seated there and I arrest you, this is now a death sentence for you, because you will be worked to death for standing there and not being able to prove that you work for a white man. Or if we say it's not necessary for you to actually steal any livestock, all that's necessary is for a white man to say that you did. I hope you understand the difference. So now, once we base the laws on what do black people do, now all we have to do is say, oh, this black person was doing something that we know that they were eating watermelon, therefore they are arrested. It would be, again, similar to if we say that, oh, this person was eating fufu. Oh, what's his name? His name is Kofi Asante. Oh, where is he from? He's from Kumasi. Guilty as charged. 10 years, hard labor. You understand? So in this, once you are criminalized through the laws, you have 2 options. You can either say, I will swear off of eating fufu, or you can say, oh, we are fufu eaters, I will do it. So in these criminality laws, some people, the majority said, I will not do any of these things that are listed. However, some internalized it and said, oh, it's true, we are criminals. So we had both of those types of reactions to it. And again, a European said that this is much better than slavery because we don't have to take care of them. We can work them to death. And in this convict leasing, from there you had debt slavery, peonage, which in things like sharecropping, what they would do is that they would say you owe a debt and now you have to work it off. So you have to work for me for 1 year because of your debt. And there was a case of one African who he was just approached by the constable who saw him walking to meet his wife on the railroad tracks. He said, "You owe me a debt. Pay me the money you owe me." He says, "I've never seen you before. I don't owe you a debt." But he was arrested, and he had to work on one of the harshest farms or plantations in the South. Lashes, whippings, all of the above. So you had a transition from chattel enslavement to what they call debt slavery, to what they call chain gangs, and what they call sharecropping, to the point that 800,000 Africans were ensnared in that system. Only those are the ones that we have documentation on, and documentation of 9,000 who died at the very least. But what about the ones that we don't know? And I want to bring these together. The convict leasing was also tied to terrorism through what was called lynching. And one of the stories, I want to share a story of a common practice that ties together this convict leasing with the lynching. That on the evening of 16th May 1918, a 31-year-old white plantation owner, Hampton Smith, known to abuse and beat his workers, was shot and killed on the plantation by one of his black workers, 19-year-old Sidney Johnson. Smith's notoriety as a usually severe boss made recruiting workers difficult. Smith resolved the labor shortage through the use of what? Convict labor. Among those, so once this white man was killed, of course a mob was raised in order to kill as many black people as they could get their hands on. And one of those who was killed was named Hayes Turner. And he was seized, and once he was seized, his 8-month pregnant wife, Mary, he was seized and killed brutally. And his wife, Mary, denied that her husband had been involved in anything that had to do with it. They knew the one person who did it. And she said that she would see that all of those who committed this heinous act would be tried in the court of law. Well, the mob didn't take kindly to this, so what did they do? Well, they took her, a mob of several hundred brought her to Folsom Bridge over Little River. The mob then tied her ankles, hung her upside down from a tree, doused her in gasoline and motor oil, and set her on fire. While Turner was still alive, a member of the mob split her abdomen open with a knife. Her unborn child fell on the ground, where it gave a cry before it was stomped on and crushed. Finally, her body was riddled with hundreds of bullets. And this was the type of treatment that Africans received under this convict leasing system. And let's now make the correlation and bring it up to date, because I've been given 15 minutes, so that means I have about 2.2 seconds per year over the past 400 years in order to tell my family's story. That what is the modern day pig law? Well, the modern day pig law is what they call the war on drugs. It's what they call the war on gangs. So what they do is, and this is, there's an author named Michelle Alexander who has a book called The New Jim Crow. All of those laws that were passed at that time were called Jim Crow laws. So now we have the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration and age of color blindness. So they say race doesn't exist. However, African people are still being victimized based on their race. And the war on drugs is having all of these types of consequences. And in this, you have racial disparity in the criminal justice system, such as 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for crack versus powder cocaine. Again, the whites looked outside the window and said, "Oh, are the black people using crack or powder cocaine? Oh, they're using crack, so therefore 100-to-1. And with this, we also have to ask the question of where does the crack come from, that this is coming from coca leaves. I'm not sure if you are aware of the layout of black communities, but there are no cocoa farms in the projects. There are no cocoa farms. And if you are interested in knowing how it gets into the community, I would suggest that you look at a short documentary called Crack the CIA, which talks about the CIA's role in bringing these drugs into the black community. And it includes, interestingly enough, a former LAPD police officer named Michael Rupert, who was approached by CIA agents to help them filter this into the black community. You may also wonder, how do the guns come in? There are no black-owned gun factories. I wish that there were, but there are no black-owned gun factories. that we have to start asking these types of questions to start getting the right types of answers. And at that time, back in the 1800s, you had a 3-to-1 disparity where black people are more than 3 times more likely to be sentenced for these types of things that get them into the convict leasing system. And today, you still have that 3-to-1. That crime statistics show in 1999 that blacks were far more likely to be targeted by law enforcement for drug crimes, 3.7 times more likely to be arrested than whites. And along with that, even though black people only comprise 13% of regular drug users, they make up 35% of drug arrests, 55% of convictions, and 74% of those who are sent to prison for drug crimes. And nationwide, Africans who are sent to state prisons for drug offenses, they are done so 13 times more often than white men. So this means that if you are caught doing the same thing that a white person does, the only one who will be prosecuted is going to be the black person. And this is the same thing that we saw during those earlier times. And it may also be interesting to you that they had what was called convict leasing then, that now what they called it by changing the name is privatized prisons. And privatized prisons means that you still work for free for these corporations. And these such corporations include IBM, Boeing, Motorola, Microsoft, AT&T, and at least 37 states have legalized the contracting of prison labor by private corporations. And this is 130,000 people who are there in these types of private prisons. And again, there's no discrimination based on age, that you have people who are under 16 years old who are caught up in this system, and they receive as little as 16 cents per hour. And I know people who sell plantain chips out on the street who earn more than 16 or 17 cents per hour. And in this, you have such a case where this is about the equivalent of saying, back in the days, you would be given a sack, you would be given rags, and you would be given slop to eat, and that would be your compensation for working for free. That a quote from one of the higher ups in one of these prison industrial complexes is that we do not believe we will see a decline in the need for detention beds, that's what they call it, particularly in an economy with rising unemployment among American workers. This is white welfare, in other words. If crime ever stopped in the United States, the judges would be out of a job, the police would be out of a job, the prison workers would be out of a job. So they have a very much of a vested interest in ensuring that African people are arrested and put into these types of systems. And similar to, I gave you the example of Alabama, where they said that the profits rose through the roof from 14,000 to the equivalent of 4 million, that this has gone up to a $1.31 billion industry. And to give you another short comparison, that the total number of enslaved Africans in border states in 1860 was 400,000. Well, those who are enslaved, the black people who are enslaved in prison, are over 800,000 today, making up 39% of the total prison population, even though we're only 13% of the population. And guess what? We won't get sympathy because we are criminals. All that has to be said is they committed a crime, therefore they can continue to work for free. Now, we've established that slavery still exists, and because this is dealing with the slave routes, you may wonder, what are the new slave routes? Well, there was a special on Al Jazeera called the School to Prison Pipeline, which means that once black children are diagnosed as having ADHD, a made-up disorder saying that they are hyperactive and can't sit down, now they can be put into special ed. They can also be suspended. And an education secretary said that black students were 3 times as likely as whites to be expelled. In the county where I went to school, called Wake County, one county over where my ancestors were enslaved, that 40% of black students caught with cell phones were suspended compared to 17% of white students. This means they're caught for doing the exact same thing. However, you have a disparity in this. Another thing was that in Wake County, again, students were 5 times more as likely to be suspended as white students. In Cook County, Chicago, every single one of the students who were referred to law enforcement were black. That's 65 of them, even though blacks only make up 38% of the population. That it was found that black students do not act up more often or more severely than white students. However, they are 5 times as likely to be suspended and referred to law enforcement. So, again, black students are more likely to be steered from graduation. They're more prone to drop out and be entangled in the criminal justice system. And I want you to know that this is very intentional. We need people, Africans, to be ensnared into the system. And today, private prisons are the main ones who are detaining young people. And private prison companies own more than 50% of youth correctional facilities in the United States. They had a case where some judges were caught getting kickbacks, over $1 million in the Kids for Cash scandal. Again, for offenses such as mocking a principal on MySpace, trespassing in a vacant building, shoplifting DVDs. Again, it's not necessarily that they actually shoplift, it's only necessary that what a white man said that they did. And in these cases, they were given over to these private prisons, and the private prisons were paying the judges to send these black children into them to do what? To work for free for these corporations whose names I've already mentioned. So this is something that I wanted you to know. As we talked about, I started off saying that one of the main legacies is that we don't know about a lot of these things. So one, I wanted you to know that slavery still exists, and also the slave routes still exist, just under a different name. It's gone from chattel enslavement to convict leasing to chain gangs to sharecropping, and now to private prisons. It's gone from lynching to convict mistreatment to now police brutality, but we have the same results and we have the same effects. So at this point I would like to close, and I want to see how much you've gotten from this presentation. I want to know if you can finish my sentence. All right, is everyone ready? Yes. All right. Slavery by any other name is still? Slavery. All right, because you did well on that, I'll give you a bonus. Genocide by any other name is still? Genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate this other side of American history. We use the one word about kingdom, about civil rights movement, but we'll get to that during discussion. There's another side of the story. Now it gives me great pleasure to present to you our Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador. He's been everywhere in the world, Ambassador Thomas. He's going to talk about the impact in Africa.